thank you so much for coming out. I am incredibly excited to welcome our first speaker of the year, Ms. Fritzi Horstman from the Compassion Prison Project, to talk about what has become her life work. And we're lucky to be able to have her with us, albeit electronically, tonight, to talk about what she has been doing. I'm going to switch cameras here momentarily so that she can see you. And when time comes for questions, make sure you're thinking about questions for her. We'll have plenty of time for that. That's the microphone. You're going to come up. You don't have to get close to it. You just have to stand in front of it so that she can hear you. And then we will get started. Okay? All right. All right, Fritzi, I'm going to switch the camera, and then it's all you.
Thank you, Jason. Hello, skeptics. Good to see you all. I'm calling from Los Angeles. I'm the founder of the Compassion Prison Project. I've been doing this for the past 3 years. And I found that doing this was my real passion, but I didn't even know. I'm 58 years old and I didn't know what my passion was. I thought it was filmmaking. But then, of course, as you'll see in the next film that I show you, this is a film I made. So it combined all the passions that I have. So without further ado, let me share Step Inside the Circle. We made this film. We finished filming this film about 3 weeks before the lockdown in 2020. And I'm just sorry, I have a dog. Sorry about that. And I'm going to try and mute myself. Sorry about that. Bravo. Okay, here we go with the film, Step Inside the Circle. It's time now, everyone. We're going to do the Compassion Trauma Circle. Is everyone ready to face their past with compassion? Is that a yes? While you were growing up, during your first 18 years of life, if a parent or other adult in the household often or very often would swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, step inside the circle. If a parent or other adult in the household often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or threw something at you, step inside the circle. If a parent or other adult in the household often or very often ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured, step inside the circle. If you often felt that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, step inside the circle. If your family lived in extreme poverty, step inside the circle. Step inside the circle. Step inside the circle. Step inside the circle. I was abused as a young girl. I was beaten by my mother. I was verbally abused by my mother. I was sexually abused by another man. My father was an alcoholic. My mother was a rageaholic. I've driven drunk. I've sold drugs. I was a juvenile delinquent. Probably my story is similar to most of your stories in here.
I'm white and I'm female and nothing happened to me. So, I got a get out of jail free card. And so I'm here now because I see myself in every one of you.
I'm a traumatized child, raised by a traumatized child. My mother was traumatized, as well as her parents.
Like he said, we wasn't born in the world of being evil people. My mother didn't want me. She hid her pregnancy. She tried to flush me down the toilet. But as I learned about these things, I always asked myself what was wrong with me.
When I come to the circle and I see everybody else, and she's reading off the questions and people stepping in further, I look at my childhood and I'm like, a lot of these people in this yard are just like me.
There was one step I should have taken that I didn't take, and I saw some of my brothers and my friends take that step, and I felt like such a coward. You know, I wasn't brave enough to be there with them when they took that step. And every round after that, I took the most difficult step.
Our traumas kept us separated. We were all on a circumference, all standing apart. But once we began to acknowledge our traumas publicly, it brought us all closer together.
In prison, you're not supposed to show your weaknesses in prison, though. But to want to do that, to walk in that circle like that, and to take each step forward was a reminder to ourselves that we still have the humanity and we worthy to be loved, though. Most people on the outside don't understand that we want to change so we can re-enter society better than what we left it. And I think one of the things that when you was yelling at no shame, and you had us yelling it out, it was freeing us too. And it was a point to where when I was looking at that and we was all looking at it in a circle, you can hear that echo, no shame. And that was very powerful, especially coming from a little lady like you.
I'm 76 years old. I've seen a lot. I don't like talking. I like to meet people that understand what's happening without words. And you one of them. Today has been one of the best days I had in my whole entire life. So I'm ready to call it something.
Your true spirits are not violent. Your true spirits are magnificent.
Hey, Fritzi, you're still muted.
I'm so sorry. So who has questions? Maybe the person in the pink. I know he raised his hand and then there was a few questions. So let's go. Let's bring them up. Right there in the front row.
That was me. I didn't know you were on mute.
Oh, is that what you were all doing? Okay. Does anyone have any questions? Sorry. All right. Yes, okay. Yes, I can't see all of you, so maybe just...
Go ahead. Just stand right in the middle.
Go ahead.
Just project.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you, like, what inspired you to start this project?
Yeah, okay, so I used to work in Hollywood, and one of the things I do is I auction material, you know, to make movies out of them. And so one of the things that's always bothered me since I was a young girl was homeless people and the way African Americans were treated. And so I started, once I finished this film called The Defiant Ones, which I was one of the producers. When I finished that film, I started optioning material. And then one of my friends told me to go to, he had visited a prison and he had volunteered and he invited me to go. And so I went, and about a month before I went to prison, I visited prison. I had read a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is by Bessel van der Kolk. It's this book, and when I read it, it informed me that I was traumatized, and I didn't know that I was a traumatized person. I didn't know what trauma was, and I didn't know what trauma did to the brain, body, and spirit. And it was the biggest relief that I had, because then I realized that my behavior, some of my lashing out at friends, or, with my child, I've carried on the trauma my mother and father gave to me. I carried that on into my family. I realized that it was my trauma, it wasn't who I was. And then a month later, I walked into a prison, and I just was in a room full of men who had done something very bad, but that was their behavior, that wasn't who they were. And discovering that, I realized that what we're doing in society is wrong. What we're doing in the criminal justice system is hurting people that are already hurt. They've already been destroyed, and then we're going in there and we're annihilating them. And so I realized that I had an obligation. It was my obligation to myself and to my family and to my community to do something about what I'm seeing in prison and what we're doing. And I invite all of you, if you get an opportunity to go to a prison, go, because it'll change. All the things you've been told about people living in prison are wrong. And you hear about the violence, and the reason people are violent is because that's what they were programmed, that's what they were taught as little children. So I'm going to share. Do we have any more questions before I have a little presentation to show you? Anybody else? Okay, we'll gather your questions for later. But this is what I show to governors, and I show to departments of correction throughout the United States and Scotland. And it's let's make sure you got it. Okay, you can all see that? Trauma-informed prisons, yeah? Thumbs up, someone? Yeah, okay, good. All right, here we go. So our mission at Compassion Prison Project is to transform prisons and communities through compassionate action, and we just changed our mission, and now it's creating trauma-informed prisons and communities. That's what we decided, but we didn't have time to change the slide. Understanding childhood trauma allows us to shift from judgment and blame to understanding and compassion. It has been said that if child abuse and neglect were to disappear today, the diagnostic and statistical manual would shrink to the size of a pamphlet, and in 2 generations, the prisons would be empty. The problem. It may be hard to believe, but the 3 largest mental health facilities in the US are the Cook County Jail in Chicago, the Los Angeles County Jail, and Rikers Island Jail in New York City. Basically, our prisons are our mental health centers. So what is an adverse childhood experience? What you saw in that circle that the men were stepping into were some of the questions that are asked on the adverse childhood experience quiz that was created by Dr. Vince Folletti of Kaiser Permanente and Robert Anda of the CDC. And they found that people who have adverse childhood experiences or childhood trauma end up having adverse health effects in adulthood. So these are the 10 adverse childhood experiences on that quiz, but there are about 30 to 40 of them. So this is just the top 10 that they discovered. Physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, parents divorced or separated, domestic violence, parent or caregiver addicted to drugs or alcohol, parent or caregiver who is depressed or mentally ill, and a household member who's ever been incarcerated. I have 8 of those. And statistics say that 64% of Americans have at least one. And in prison, it's 98%. So what happens when the body is traumatized? What happens when you endure childhood trauma? Okay. So what happens is the amygdala, so there's the brainstem. This is the place that senses there's danger it's in your neck and your brainstem. It senses there's danger. And it sends a signal to the amygdala to shut down parts of bodily functions that are not necessary, like digestion and the prefrontal cortex. So the amygdala governs fear-based instincts, emotional memory, recognition of emotions and behavior, defensive behavior, stress hormone release, long-term memory, aggression. Basically, when you're cranky, usually when you're cranky, the amygdala is involved in this somehow. So the amygdala also shuts down the prefrontal cortex, like I said. Now, this is the prefrontal cortex, and the brain doesn't fully develop the prefrontal cortex until it's 25 years old. Insurance companies know this because your insurance rates go down after you turn 25 because people start making better decisions, children and teenagers start making better decisions once they cross the 25-year threshold. And in some adults, it's 27, 28, 29. And so the prefrontal cortex governs behavior control, self-monitoring, mental flexibility, judgment, inhibition of behavior, problem-solving, planning, anticipation, speaking, emotional expression, awareness of abilities, motor planning, personality, limitations, organization, ability to pay attention, concentration, initiation, wisdom, understanding of consequences, understanding of morality, good versus evil, understanding that what I see in his hand is a cell phone and not a gun. But if that part is offline, you're just in fight or flight mode. And I bet you, and also, it turns off your ability to actually, it's called your functional IQ. It turns off your functional IQ where you barely can speak words. Like when I'm in fight or flight, I've noticed that I'm unable to articulate anything except it keeps available the ability to curse. So it keeps the curse words available, but not your ability to really have really intelligent conversations, negotiation. So remember, when you're traumatized, this is all that's going on, and you're in fight or flight. This is the state of fight or flight when your prefrontal cortex is shut down. And this is why our criminal justice system is flooded with people living in prison, because everyone is in fight or flight, and they're still in fight or flight in prison, but we'll get to that later. So trauma and toxic stress alter how the brain functions. Persistent stress changes brain architecture. So look at the depressed brain, which is barely lit up, and look at the lit up brain. But if you're traumatized, it's like a fog has been put onto the top of your brain. How stress changes a child's brains. These are 2 3-year-old children. The first one is a normal brain, and look at the brain of the extreme neglect child. This is a brain from a Romanian orphanage child who was neglected. And not only does it harm all developmental milestones and impede developmental milestones, but it also, it reduces your brain by 1/3. And not only, and look at the firing and wiring, the synapses aren't firing and wiring like they should. Prolonged exposure to trauma triggers physiological changes in the brain. Neural circuits are disrupted, causing changes in the hippocampus, the brain's memory and emotional center. This can cause brain shrinkage, problems with memory, learning, and behavior. A child does not learn to regulate emotions when living in a state of constant stress, associated with greater risk of chronic disease, mental health problems in adulthood. And this is also associated with violence in neighborhoods, with police brutality, you've heard about correctional officers assaulting inmates, and also prison residents assaulting each other as well. And the fight I had with my sister the fights I would have with my sister when I was a kid. So ACEs, adverse childhood experiences without intervention, predict the following adverse health outcomes. 3 or more ACEs, 60% increased risk of autoimmune disease, lupus, MS, rheumatoid arthritis, type 1 diabetes. 4 or more ACEs, 2.5 times more likely to be diagnosed with lung cancer or with lung disease or cancer. 4.5 times more likely to face Alzheimer's or depression. 7 times more likely to go to prison. 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. And a huge increase in becoming a victim of opioid abuse. 5 or more ACEs, 8 times more likely to become an alcoholic. And 6 or more ACEs shortens a lifespan by 20 years. My mother died at 69, my father died at 61. Both had, I don't know exactly how many ACEs because I didn't know to ask this question, but I know my mother was abused all of her life emotionally and physically. And I know that, just know that when you're emotionally abused, that's one of the worst things that can happen to a child because they don't really get a sense of who they are anymore. Their sense of self is basically destroyed by the emotional abuse. So, as I mentioned, 64% of the US population has at least one ACE, so that means in your room, in the room that you're in, 64% of the people in your room have at least one ACE. In prison, 98% of the people surveyed have one or more ACEs. In the surveys we did these surveys. 15% of the people in the US have 4 or more ACEs. In our surveys in prison, 70 to 80% of the incarcerated men have 4 or more ACEs. And 64% of the people in prison that we surveyed have 6 or more ACEs. That means 64% of the people in prison's life expectancy diminishes by 20 years unaddressed if we do not address this trauma. So prisons traumatize and re-traumatize through practices and traditions of punishment, coercion, custody, and control, instead of using common sense mental health practices and compassion. Custody and control. These practices are enforced and condoned by the state, officers' unions, and the departments of correction. And the governor's office. I took that out because we present to the governor's offices. We're at a 65% recidivism rate in the US. That means recidivism means when you go back to prison, so they let you out and you come back. So every 3 people that leave prison to return at this state in the United States. Prisons do not create public safety. That means if 2 people go back into prison, that means there are 2 more victims that have been created. In prison residents are faced with dehumanization. They're being referred to as numbers, last names, hey you, seeing others as less than, shaming, us versus them, human trafficking, substandard food, little to no educational program or vocational opportunities, systems of control, use of shackles, handcuffs, violation of privacy, sleep deprivation, emotional abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect. Sounds like ACEs to me. Medical neglect, mental illness neglect, dental abuse and neglect, physical abuse, postponement of compassionate release, arbitrary board and parole hearings. Torture, physical torture, mental torture, solitary confinement. More than 15 days is considered torture according to the United Nations. Emotional torture, control of interaction with community and family, no preparedness for reentry, no normalcy, lack of access to books, education, mental health, nature, with no possibilities for laughter, fun, and joy. Recidivism rate at 65%. Returning citizens are set up to fail, technology challenged, handicapped as far as functioning in the modern day world, support systems restricted, contact with prison friends is prohibited, former ties often compromised, treated as lower class citizens, voting rights revoked, job opportunities scarce, social services limited or denied, social integration difficult to impossible. For the officers, the correctional officers, there's a lack of accountability. What happens on the yard stays on the yard. Code of silence within the culture of correctional officers. Coming forward means a loss of status, position, safety, and community. For prison residents, lack of ways to earn money, lack of pay for any way to supplement life, food supplies, well-being, family support, and profiting off of residents. Phone calls are higher than market rate. Digital contact is exploitative. Supplies from outside vendors are inflated. Commissary prices are inflated. JPay, GTL, and other companies are extorting the impoverished community. Remember, if you're 80% of the people that are incarcerated are indigent. When you're indigent, it means you're unable to pay for a lawyer. That means those families, that 80% of the people's families are also indigents, and they can't pay for families. I know a woman who had to choose between having electricity or paying or talking to her son on the phone. So she talked to her son in the dark. So solitary confinement. Solitary is overused, misused, and abused. This is Rick Ramish, former executive director of Colorado Department of Corrections. Ramish cites an 80% reduction of violence and aggressive behavior after long-term solitary was abolished in the Department of Corrections in Colorado. And Ramish spent a night in solitary. He spent 23 hours in solitary. And in that time, he didn't know if it was day or night. He had no sense of his space, or his senses started deteriorating, and he couldn't get any sleep. And so this is what we're doing to, I forgot the number, but this is what we're doing to a lot of our citizens in the United States. So the physical effects of solitary, oh, by the way, this is where they do group counseling at Pelican Bay in California. These men sit in cages and talk about their problems. And Pelican Bay was famous for being, they filed a lawsuit against Pelican Bay for extended amounts of solitary, 20, 30 years. I know a man who spent 30 years in solitary. Physical effects include chronic headaches, eyesight deterioration, digestive problems, dizziness, excessive sweating, fatigue and lethargy, urinary problems, heart palpitations, hypersensitivity to light and noise, loss of appetite, muscle and joint pain, sleep problems, trembling hands, and weight loss. Mental health effects of solitary, anxiety and stress. Oh, and they call it administrative segregation. They don't call it solitary confinement. They're making it seem like it's no big deal. This is a big deal. Other health effects, anger, irritability, and hostility. What happens when you're in your amygdala 24/7? When your amygdala is saying, I'm in danger, so it's sending the alarm all the time. Of course you're irritable, of course you're angry. Worsen pre-existing mental health issues, sensitivity to sounds and smells, problem with attention, concentration, and memory. Hallucinations that affect all of the senses, paranoia, poor impulse control, social withdrawal, outbursts of violence, psychosis, fear of death, self-harm, including mutilation of genitals, cutting open of abdomen, biting through veins, and self-blindness, all documented cases, and suicide. And one of the men I worked with at Kern Valley State Prison, he was in solitary for 8 years. He goes home now. He's out from prison, but now he has agoraphobia. He goes to work and he comes home and he sits in his room, and that's what he does. That's what we've done to this man. And I know New York is just abolished solitary, but this is something we have to do it across the United States. Prisons are a danger to the well-being of the incarcerated population, prison staff, families, communities, and society. And did you know that the average life expectancy of a U.S. citizen is 78 years? The average life expectancy of a correctional officer is 59 years old. That presents as having 6 or more ACEs, as we discussed earlier. The contributing factors for correctional officers: PTSD, trauma, and stress. 35% of the male COs suffer from PTSD, 29% of the females. But that's what's been reported. I'd say the number's 70 to 85%. Then there's a 39 to 50% higher chance of suicide in this occupation, and 20% higher chance of separation and divorce than the national average. And we can turn this around though. So Norway is one of the models. They have an exchange program that they're starting in California. They've done it in Oregon. They're doing it in Washington. They've done it in North Dakota, and they're bringing some of the principles of Norway to the prison systems in the United States. The principles are the normality principle. Normalization is when the prisoners, they go in and they make their breakfast, they do their laundry. They live a normal life that we live. They go to class, they go to work, they come home, they watch television, they read a book. But it's a normal life instead of institutionalization where you wait for somebody to open the door. One of my friends who was in Kern Valley, another man, he sat in his bed waiting for someone to open the door before he got out of bed. He thought someone was going to come and open the door. He's free, he's a free man now. But this is what institutionalization does. Activation, that means people get out of their cells all day. You get them busy, you get them working, you get them thinking, because a lot of these maximum security prisons, they're in their cells 23 hours a day. They might have a roommate, but they're still basically in isolation and they're deteriorating. Progression towards integration, that means as a prison resident demonstrates that they're rehabilitating, you move them to lower level yards, which has more opportunities for programming and freedom of movement. And the import model, we bring the outside in, we bring the communities into the prisons, we bring doctors and dentists who care about the health and the mental health of people living in prison, instead of letting people rot. I know one of the men that works for us, we hired him, he was in Delaware. All of his front teeth are gone. He has no teeth. Like, what happened? Why were his teeth taken care of? And so this is Are Hardal. He's the governor, they call him the governor. He's the warden of Halden prison in Norway. he's sitting there having berries with the prison residents. And in Norway, the punishment of prison is the restriction of liberty, and that is it. You're still a citizen, you still have voting privileges, you're still regarded in society as someone that has value. So, at our vision at Compassion Prison Project is all prisons become healing and mental health centers in the next 3 years. 2021, which we are doing. I have great news for you. Trauma-informed, trauma-responsive training and curriculum. But I will talk about trauma talks. Remind me to tell you about trauma talks. I'm just throwing up the book, but that's our curriculum. The first thing we have to do is do no harm. We need accountability from prisons and state. We can no longer abuse the people living in prison. Body cams on all correctional officers. Systems of control and torture eliminated. Phasing out of solitary. Therapy and mental health support for all released from solitary. And if there's 70% of the people in prison have mental health issues, we need therapy for everybody. Drug rehabilitation treatment replaces drug use penalties. Trauma-informed, trauma-responsive training for all correctional officers and staff. Trauma-informed, trauma-responsive education for all residents. Stress mitigating practices, a la Nadine Burke-Harris, who is the Surgeon General of California, who came to support our work at Compassion Prison Project 2 weeks ago at Valley State Prison. So and she said to me, Gavin Newsom sent me, Gavin Newsom is our governor, she said, Gavin Newsom sent me, and the state has your back. But she endorses stress mitigating practices, which I encourage all of you to also follow: enough sleep, nutrition, exercise, mindfulness, mental health care, and healthy relationships. And no longer profiting off of residents. Free phone calls, free digital contact, vendor supplies at retail market prices or less, commissary prices at retail market prices or less. We're going to educate the officers to become trauma-informed. Framingham, Massachusetts, in their facility, they implemented the practices of having a trauma-informed prison. They cite a 62% decrease in inmate assaults on staff, a 54% decrease on inmate assaults, 60% decline on one-on-one mental health watches, and a 16% decline in psychiatric petitions. And so just so you know, you guys are becoming trauma-informed. Becoming trauma-informed, you learn about the effects of trauma and PTSD on the brain and body. You take the Adverse Childhood Experiences quiz, which I can give to Jason at the end, and he can send it to you guys. And it might be a great idea if you guys did an adverse childhood experience, an ACE awareness campaign, because even if many of your classmates and peers aren't traumatized, it's good to know about the trauma that's in society. It's very important, and you never know. There could be people that are in your school that are traumatized, and trauma awareness is really important so that person and your community can have enough support. Learn about the impact of ACEs on mental health and fight or flight. Learn about brain science and trauma, which you've learned a little bit about. Learn about the prevalence of mental illness in prison. Learn about triggers, fight, flight, freeze. We didn't talk about that. So we're going to be doing a pilot of trauma talks. And in the first 6 months, we want 10 pilot programs in 10 different prisons in 10 different states. Right now, we launched our first pilot 2 weeks ago at Valley State Prison. 2,900 incarcerated men are going to be doing the program. And now all this other stuff, we need to raise money for, but we also encourage nutritious food, fruits and vegetables, etc. Arts and sciences, art classes, dance classes, music, gardening, animal training, science, computer lab, digital photography, and healing modalities and practitioners. We are including healing modalities in our curriculum. So this is actually getting to them. EMDR, not yet, but somatics, tapping, cognitive therapy, not yet. Group therapy, yes, yoga and meditation. In 2022. So we will be rolling out to 10 prisons in the next couple of months, actually. We're a little bit late, but that's okay, we had to develop the curriculum. 2022, all prisons are trauma-informed and trauma-responsive. And that means that every prison resident and every correctional officer knows what trauma is and starts responding to it. All prisons become communities. Residents, mandatory peer-to-peer groups daily for all residents, educational programs restored, self-improvement, tablets and computer access for everyone living in prison, job opportunities and job pay. You know, the 13th Amendment says that people living in prison, it's okay for them to be a slave. Most of the people living in prison make 8 cents to like 40 cents an hour, and that's it. And they have to pay for their phone, for their commissary, not their phone calls, because their family has to pay for that. But if they can't afford their commissary, their family has to pay for the commissary. So it's coming out of the poorest people in the United States are having to bear the burden of the incarcerated men when they're they're working, they're doing their jobs, and they should get paid for it. Elimination of provision for human trafficking, AKA slavery, family centers, family visits, family support, and the same for correctional officers and staff. They need education also. They need to know about PTSD, mental health. And in 2023, all prisons will become healing centers and mental health institutions. So this is Norway. And the only evidence you can see that this is a prison is the officer in the bottom left playing volleyball with some of the people that live there. And they go shopping. So they go shopping for their food. And look at the food they have. In prison, you barely see a grape or a blueberry, much less food that's nutritious. So all prisons become families. Focus on successful reentry and connection with home community. Normalization, we spoke about that. Prisons redesigned with community centers, classrooms, studios, physical education rooms, and quiet rooms. Mental health modalities are part of the daily schedule. Dr. Yard, we'll just skip over this because now we're really hot on trauma talk, so we'll talk more about that instead. When we heal our own trauma, individually and collectively, we don't just heal our bodies. By refusing to pass on the trauma we inherited, we help heal the world. Oh, and by the way, this is Howard Ford, he was the man at the end of the film who said, "This is one of the best days of my life." He's been incarcerated for over 4 years, and he just lost both of his legs because of COVID. They had to amputate above the knee on one of his legs, and below the knee on another one of his legs. So he's now in a wheelchair. I'm glad that we got to see him when he was in his full health. They moved him to another facility, but he doesn't have a family. So now he has to make friends all over again. And he doesn't have the support that he had. So these decisions get made, blatantly, without concern. And we've asked the governor to let him out on compassionate release, but no word yet. Being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of mental health. Safe connections are fundamental to meaningful and satisfying lives. Trauma is a fact of life. It does not, however, have to be a life sentence. Unexpected kindness is the most powerful, least costly, and most underrated agent of human change. So there you go. Who's got questions? I hope there's some questions.
Yeah, when you have questions, just kind of come closer to the middle so that we can make sure that Fritzi can hear you.
Hi, I actually had a question about how you work on getting word about your project out externally, because I think it's really great that you're going in, working with the legislation and governors and internally with the prisons, but I think a big aspect is also changing public opinion on that sort of thing, because that system still is very stigmatized. So how do you get that out there?
Thank you. Yes. So if everyone in this room will share Step Inside the Circle and go to our website at compassionprisonproject.org. Over 3.5 million people have seen Step Inside the Circle, but maybe it belongs on TikTok. We tried TikTok. I don't know how to do TikTok, but you guys know how to do TikTok. I mean, you guys can create a whole movement. You guys can tell the whole world to get busy with Compassion Prison Project. I don't know what the word is. My son's 15, so he'd be mortified to hear me speak. But it's up to you guys. I think you guys know the way how to make this happen. And if you all put your brains together, and if each of you told 30 people, we might have another viral video again. That we had it last April 2020. It was viral. What a day that was. But do it again. It's time to raise awareness. Oh, before we have another question, I wanted to just tell you about Trauma Talks. So Trauma Talks is the video series that we're creating. Because of COVID, we can't go into prisons. And it made me think that we need to really get all 1.8 million people in prison information about their trauma. And so there's just all kinds of workbooks. People have been reading it. They love it at prison, but it talks about the brain science. It kind of does what we just discussed here, but it's accompanied by the video. So it has some of my information and some of my hard truths, like stop with the shenanigans. No more shenanigans in prison. We gotta get busy. We gotta build a new world because the world needs you. And so it's a 12-part video series accompanied by the workbook. And the thing about it is if we get 1.8 million workbooks to everyone in prison, which is our goal, we're estimating it's like anywhere from $30 million to $38 million. So if you know anybody who's got, a couple of million lying around, we would definitely appreciate that. So in addition to getting the word out, anyone with a couple $1 million, we need it right now because we just delivered 2,900 workbooks. That was $10,000. But that's only chapters 1 and 2. So multiply that and you start getting to where all these millions of dollars are needed. And we did another circle at that prison, and we had the volunteers held up the signs that said "You matter," and the guys were just so moved and so appreciative that they were seen for other than just their crime. I mean, all of us have done shenanigans, right? All of us we've all broken the law in little ways, even if it's just jaywalking. But, like I said in the video, I've driven home drunk, but I was also an accessory to a robbery. My best friend got robbed because of me. I had the key to her house and we were just gonna crash there and these guys stole her stuff. So anyway, that's on me, that's my crime. I didn't get put in prison. But imagine if I got put in prison, I wouldn't be doing this. But imagine the people that are in prison that can come and help us. And I can prove to you there's there's at least 1.799% of the million people that are valuable and that we need. They're all valuable, what am I saying? But that can come back and help our society. So who has another question?
Whoever's next, just want to get to the middle and ask questions.
Hi, I was just wondering how your project itself changed my understanding of democratic damage.
Great question. Unfortunately, only 2 people that I've worked with have come home. So, actually, no. Victor, the man that his mother wanted to flush himself down the toilet, but I didn't work with him for an extended period of time. But he's out now. He's doing well. He's working with the homeless. He's helping the homeless. He's bringing shoes and food to them. Then there's Joe, who goes to work and then comes home. And then there's Darnell. Darnell's a superstar. He was working for us. And then because we're kind of a startup and we're not really structured and we don't have an office, it was really hard to, give him guidance. And so I got him a job. He's making $20 an hour working with returning citizens. But I told the people that hired him, I said, I want him back in a year because I know in a year we're gonna have all these workbooks that we have to figure out how to get around and all this infrastructure. So that's the story of the 3 people I've worked with. And the other thing I wanted to talk to you about is Willie Smith. He's on death row, and we're going to execute him. Alabama's going to execute him on October 21st. And Willie wrote. I had everybody at Compassion Prison Project. We have over 800 volunteers, and I asked them to write a letter to Willie. And about 10 people took me up on the offer, and this is the letter he wrote. I'm just going to read it really quick. I think we have a moment. Dear Prison Project, how are you feeling today? I hope all is well. Let me begin by thanking you for coming into my life. On September 1st, the state of Alabama set me another execution date. It's October 21st. There used to be a time that when I cried, I could fill the ocean, but now my well is dry. Since I'm familiar to what's coming Since I'm familiar to what's to come in the coming weeks, I decided to express my heart to all of you. The name of it is called My Second Mother. My mom and I share a bond only God can give. When I call her, I say it's mommy time. She told me when she was pregnant with me that she made a promise to love me more than herself. My favorite pie is sweet potato, and I remember how I used to lick the bowl. I remember that she made me a pie all by myself, and oh my God, it didn't last long. I remember calling her one day crying so bad that I was so sorry for what I had done, and I wanted to come home. She calls me Junior. She said, Junior, if I could sit in the electric chair for you, I'd give my life just so you can live yours. I remember when my dad used to whip me so long and she'd come to my rescue only to have the belt turned on her. I remember on my birthday she'd come to visit and would buy a cake from the vending machine singing happy birthday to me. She promised me when I got in trouble that she'd always be here for me until there's no breath in her body. My life has always been painful. If I wasn't called ugly, I was called nasty, and most of my peace came when I'd done something stupid. I wanted to be liked, I wanted to be loved, and above all, accepted. So he's living in fight or flight his entire life. His father's beating him, people are humiliating him. When times get so rough and I fall so asleep and I fall so deep, thoughts like, I'll never be nothing or accomplish anything. My mom works at night, and when there's no one around, a letter hits my door from, these are the volunteers, from Sonia, Dawn, Nora, Tim, Casey, Payfin, Surlis, and I cry because you are my second mother. You all constantly remind me that I'm loved, that I'm forgiven, that I'm somebody. When no one else writes, I go back to all the cards you all sent. This type of love is like giving me the sweet potato bowl to lick. This type of compassion is like a mother's love. So I want to say thank you for my Coke. Thank you for hugging me when my mom wasn't able to at the time. I call Compassion Prison Project a second mother because that's how I feel. I have no idea who all I didn't mention. My apologies if I left you out. I have no idea if God will ever call me home. I'm not ready to die, but if he does, if I have the chance to talk to Jesus, I will tell him thank you for my second mother. The end, Willie. So that's what compassion does. It makes someone who feels like nothing, like somebody. And if you all are interested in writing to Willie, you can put the Compassion Prison Project return address on the mail. You don't have to ever hear from him. But that's on offer. You can send him a letter or find out who else is getting executed and write him a letter or her a letter. Because it's not up to the state, it's not up to society to decide who has value. When anyone is born, they're valued. They're valued. And not valued, but they have value. And it is not up to anyone to determine who's good and who's bad. And I don't know who that's up to, but I know it's not up to us. And so we can turn this around. We can turn this around with our compassion. And my gosh, wouldn't that be something if every single person in your school wrote to Willie, or picked another person who's getting executed, or picked someone who's in solitary? It doesn't matter. But you have the power to change lives with your compassion and with your love. And honestly, this letter changed my life, because here I am crying again. I've cried 4 times reading this letter, and I'll probably cry again. When you love somebody, when you give compassion to somebody, it changes your life. And that's what's on offer for all of you. So any more questions? I'm sorry to be a little firm, but it's.
We have time, Fritzi, for probably 1 or 2 more questions. Somebody have
Awesome.
Go ahead.
Hi, first off, I just want to say thank you so much for doing this project. I really admire your passion and compassion for all of the people, especially the marginalized people in society. The only question I have is, what do you do if someone is not willing to receive help or open up to other people? Because I know that trauma is a very hard thing to open up to other people. So how do you do, or what actions do you have to help?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. I would say people that are traumatized, people that don't know how to accept help, ask them to sit in a circle with you. Ask them if they'd be open to just sitting in a circle and listen, and just for active listening. The biggest gift you can give to anybody is to listen. And remember, when you're listening, if you need to say something, then you're not listening. If you have a thought about what you should say, you're not listening. And anything you say to that person is, you're talking really to yourself, because what that person needs is really just to be heard and to be listened to. And I would also say, slow down, because we're going so fast, we forget to connect with people, we forget to smell the roses, and we forget to be human again. We're all in our phones, in our laptops, in our meetings, and for me, and on my Zoom calls. But slow down and connect, and that's the number one thing you can do to bring mental health back to your society and to your community, is sitting in community, sitting in circles, and even if that person is reluctant, say, just, can I sit with you? Can I just sit with you and be with you? I mean, that's what Willie wants, and that's what we're doing. We're sitting with him and being with him. And that's the biggest gift you can give. And it doesn't cost a thing, it just costs some time. But it's listening and giving your time. That's what anybody wants. That's what anybody in the world wants. And I hope that answers your question. But if there's anyone in your community that you're worried about, reach out to them. Just say, hey, I see you, and can we talk? Is there something you can talk? You might change their life, and you might save a life.
Thank you, Fritzi. I think with that wonderful message, we'll stop for this evening. We all give Ms. Horstman a round of applause.